Good afternoon. My name is Tamer Shayal. I'm a second-year student at the PhD program in Architecture, Landscape Architecture, and Urban Planning here at the GZ. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the last session of this very intriguing and rich day of critical and speculative explorations of modern spatial utopias. And to introduce our keynote speaker for this afternoon, Professor Damien White. But before that, I would like to throw two ideas that I think are kind of central to the theme of the conference, to the debates we had today, but also to the writings of Professor White. I think we have two sorts of dualisms that we've been kind of trying to bridge in the conversations in this conference. And while they are related, it's probably important to make them distinct, at least for the sake of this talk. And the first one is more a binarism that comes with the very notion of utopia itself. So it's utopia and dystopia, and with that binary mode of thinking about the world, it seems that our sense of environmental, technological, economic, and socio-political future is kind of captivated by those successive waves of hopeful idealism and despair. And I will call this a division of imaginary and psychological labor. The very discussions we had about abundance and scarcity, about desire and need, and to which degree that is kind of implicated in with each time we discuss the notion of utopia. But the second point is an equally consequential division that I think is of particular interest for us here in this program, which is not more about the emotional content of our imaginations, but more about how we engage with them and with their social implications. And I will call this a division of epistemological labor. So from critical theory and from critical scholarship to speculative engagement with socio-technical systems. So it is that space between social critique and speculative design that we scholars of the built environment find ourselves simultaneously inhabiting and questioning. An opening between, on the one hand, an analytical suspicion of what happened and what is looming on the horizon, and on the other hand, flights of hopeful imaginings of how things could be otherwise. Utopian impulses might be at the roots of both modes of engaging with the world. But whereas critical scholarship calls us to dwell on the logic and implications of constructed conditions, critical design invites us to participate in the remaking of those constructions. I might be overemphasizing the contrasts of inward and outward, of past and future, of realized and imagined, but maybe this is a manifestation of how we came to inherit the very notion of utopia in the 20th century, invariably bringing echoes of its supposed opposite, dystopia. Our keynote speaker calls for an opening of this oppositional space for a more complex ecology of multiple competing visions. Critical design as such should surpass the binarism of anticipatory visualizations of ideal and dystopic prospects, and rather help us envision the spatial and institutional grounds on which new forms of social collectivities could emerge and thrive. Speculative and critical design in this way would enrich our public debates by offering, in his words, a materialized invitation for political debate. This invitation is, in Professor White's terms, a call for futuring. And that actually reminded me of John May's comments on management, but maybe this is more of an appreciation of the multiplicity of management regimes or futuring possibilities that we could have in the future. In opposition to the static utopia and aims at re-evaluating the status of design itself, as he writes, if quote, "If we see design as a much more generalizable human capacity to act in the world, to prefigure and then materialize the reach and potential of future-oriented forms of social design, for material politics can be read in much more interesting and expansive ways. It is this unique perspective, a mode of engagement that is at once critical and anticipatory, that we look forward to this in this afternoon." Damien White is Associate Professor of Sociology and Head of the Department of History, Philosophy, and Social Science at the Rhode Island School of Design. He is a sociologist and political theorist with research and teaching interests in the sociology of design, architecture, and adaptive reuse, urban and environmental sociology with a particular interest in urban political ecology, historical and political sociology, critical theory, urban studies, and photography. He is the author of 4 books, 2 of which are particularly relevant to our discussions today: Techno-Natures, Environments, Technologies, Spaces and Places in the 21st Century, published in 2009, and The Environment, Nature and Social Theory, Hybrid Approaches, published last year with Alan Rudy and Brian Garreau. He is also currently working on a book entitled The Future by Design, Labor Design and the Ecology of Freedom. Professor White's talk is entitled Urban Political Ecologies, Democratic Invention and Creative Labor, Design Futuring in the Anthropocene. So the talk would go for 45 minutes. Afterwards, we will have a discussion moderated by our own Neil Brenner, an eminent urban theorist and professor of urban theory and the director of the Urban Theory Lab here at the Graduate School of Design. Please join me welcoming Professor Damien White.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, once again, thank you so much to the organisers for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I live down the road, even though I work at RISD, and I work in the GSD a lot of the time, or the Widener. So if you see me in there next year, when I'm trying to get this book together, say hello, drag me out for a coffee. So I'd appreciate that. So what I'm going to present today is really something of a first stab attempt on my behalf to pull together this current book that I'm going to try and write next year. And it's really attempting to think about the idea that futuring, rather than utopianism, as I would prefer to talk about it, is not something that we stand outside as academics or as citizens and attempt to do historical analysis of as an object. Rather, we are in the midst of all manner of futuring, constantly, persistently, and that this is a condition of politics and it's a condition of the political. And it's my feeling that it has been a decisive manoeuvre of both liberalism, Isaiah Berlin style, post-structuralist liberalism, Michel Foucault style, and neoliberalism, Thatcher and Reagan style, to systematically evade that condition of futuring as the presentation of material propositions for political debate, and thereby obscuring the ways in which they themselves, liberalism itself, is a utopian politics. But it looks upon everything else as crazy, bad, mad, and dangerous, okay? So I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll talk a little bit more, though, about the environmental debate and the state of the environmental debate, and my concerns about where we are. And so, first part of the talk, I'll talk a little bit about where I think the hegemonic discourses are in the environmental debate at the current time in the global north. I'll go on to suggest some problems that I see with those hegemonic discourses and the ways in which I think they're kind of sucking the air out of the possibilities of thinking about politics of the Anthropocene. And then I want to make the argument that in a material world, a material design politics, a critical design politics, must emerge, if you like, as a counterpoint to this. And I'll use the terms public ecology, I'll use the terms design ecologies, but I want to kind of think through some of the problems that we have in realising that at the moment. So I'm going to argue it's manifest, it's present, it's circulating around many critical design circles, but certain manifestations of it at the moment and certain silences and absences mean that it itself is not really in a condition of possibility to hail publics, to create other kinds of visions of an alternative Anthropocene. Okay, so that's the big agenda. I'll really try and get through it. Okay, so where are we then? Okay, so we anxious citizens of the global north, the affluent global north, have some rather conflicting attitudes to futuring. For a good 4 decades, I think it can be argued, the intellectual space between utopia, dystopia, politics and design has occupied an uncomfortable position in our culture and in the political world. In our culture, it could be argued that we are surrounded virtually every month now by CGI images of alternative futures that are visually spectacular in their capacity to render worlds anew, but are almost crushingly familiar, oftentimes, in their projected understandings of social relations. Silicon Valley, and with a few exceptions, there are critical moments here, but often profoundly dystopian. Here's Elysium, where the 1% have descended into a kind of space-aged space station, and Matt Damon's getting his kind of urban policing hybrid entity on back in a devastated Earth. So where are we then? Well, think about how we seem to be surrounded not only by crushing, remarkable visual images, but we seem to be, in the United States, surrounded by an endless supply of digitopian inventions from Silicon Valley, offering self-driving cars to the Internet of Things that transform all. And yet, these very same forces look upon the forces of gentrification and exclusion, which have come to define life in the valley for working people, as some mysterious and unalterable force of nature. Elon Musk can announce plans for Mars, which seems perfectly reasonable, but back on Earth, the idea that we could design high-quality, sustainable public housing and make this available at affordable houses, at affordable prices to working people, is widely viewed as a project beyond our capacities. Isn't that kind of curious? But it's in the formal world of Anglo-American politics, I would argue, where these tensions are particularly fraught. Since the onset of the Thatcher and Reagan years, the received wisdom has long been that those who engage in utopian speculation are, to quote the memorable words of Russell Jacoby, out to lunch or out to kill. Utopia is premised on declarations that we find ourselves at the end of history, at the moment of American empire, that we discovered the third way, that we should embrace the catalaxy of the market, have wide currency at the highest levels of power. Indeed, in the US, disciples of that most utopian of thinkers, Ayn Rand, have found themselves occupying positions from the chairman of the Federal Reserve to Senate Majority Leader. Conversely, speculation that unequal divisions of power, wealth, opportunity and cultural capital might be decisively challenged have been viewed as akin to a kind of madness. Okay, so this is interesting. But could it be that the current moment that we lurk in could reset the possibilities for thinking about futuring, thinking about dystopia, utopian options? So whilst utopia and dystopia has been, for a long time consigned to the scrap heap of history, the ascendance of climate science as the master frame of how futures are now understood and perceived in the OECD has unleashed a new torrent of dystopian and utopian imaginaries. These are imaginaries, moreover, where design is increasingly assigned a central role. The realisation that we can't stay embalmed in the world of Thatcher and Reagan, but we actually find ourselves in the Anthropocene, the Manthropocene, the Capitalocene, or a condition of planetary urbanism, which seem to shift the stakes of our debate. Suddenly, as Bruno Latour suggests, we find ourselves in a world that can be viewed as a product of design or maldesign, misdesign, a made world, not a found world. Moreover, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, amongst many other bodies, is telling us that to avoid runaway global warming quickly, urgently, immediately, we must now embark on a project of global redesign of our global socio-ecological, socio-technical, social-spatial relations, unlike anything previously attempted. So for critical designers and critical architects, the moment of the Anthropocene, it seems to me, would seem to open up real spaces for bold thinking about possible critical designed futures. Suddenly, the kind of postmodern scoffing at the transformative ambitions of modernism, which dominated many sections of the academy in the 1990s, when capital itself was transforming both the composition of ocean trenches and the atmospheric chemistry of the planet, now seemed to have entirely missed the point. So when Lyotard was telling us all we had left was petty little narratives and capital completely evading that particular juncture. And now there's other critical thinkers that we might be able to draw from to allow us to think about this. So viewed through the lens of a Lefebvrean-inspired critical urban studies, the moment of the Anthropocene could be read as one unfolding moment of the urban revolution, anticipated by Lefebvre in 1970 and much mapped now by Neil's work and his colleagues' work. And it could be seen then possibly, as Lefebvre hoped, as a moment to open up public debate about the social production of space, about the composition of everyday life, and the opportunities for opening up possibilities for thinking about self-management writ large. If we turn to critical environmental studies, it could be argued that the Anthropocene moment was actually anticipated by Neil Smith's remarkable observation a number of decades ago now, that we find ourselves negotiating the global production of nature, and that this would require, in turn, the need for a democratic production of nature as a response. So these were routes that could have existed and maybe still existed, but it seems to me at the moment that there are significant limitations, shall we say, on that kind of conversation going forward. And although it is the case that in both critical sociology and in design studies now, for the first time in perhaps 4 decades, you're starting to see a profusion of positions and arguments which are proposing, which are reconstructing, which are suggesting prefigurative potentialities. These discussions, as yet, it's not really clear that it's not really clear how much they're going to move forward, shall we say. Okay, so where exactly are we? Well, the possibility might exist for a democratic Anthropocene or a form of planetary urbanism which might be able to be open to public will formation, public reflection. But it seems to me that where we are, particularly in the environmental debate at the moment, is that there are 2 very influential hegemonic discourses emerging particularly out of the Anglo-American societies, which are in many respects sucking up the space of debate about possible futures. So this was a very important visual for any of us who are about 40 all over. I don't know if you remember this, but this is Charlton Heston's moment in Planet of the Apes, where he recognises that, sadly, this is not another planet that he thought he was on. It is the future. So what's going on in terms of the environmental debate? Well, it seems to me that Anthropocene times has clearly generated numerous points of confusion and unsettlement, particularly for traditional articulations of North American, British, and perhaps Northern European environmental positions and practices. Many classic modes of green thinking that have been drawn to what Tony Fry refers to as the illusion of permanence have had to intellectually recalibrate their position on the future of socio-political and socio-ecological relations to warming worlds. They're starting to have to recognise that we might find ourselves now in times marked by high degrees of permanent unsettlement. And it's striking to me how much this seems to be altering eco-political discourse in North America and in European eco-political thought. Now, it certainly can be observed that since the 1970s, since the earliest point of the environmental debate, neo-survivalism, neo-Malthusianism and apocalyptic thought have had a very central role in the manifestation of environmental social movements or certain currents of environmental social movements in the global north. I think it's important to point out as well, they've been highly racialised accounts. If you go back to the first few pages the population bomb. This is an account of Too Many Indians, where Ehrlich is recoiling with disgust as he moves through the streets of Delhi. I think it's quite important we think about that when we're thinking about the overpopulation debate, and how often, as David Harvey's pointed out again and again, it's too many people, but not too many of me, it's too many of them elsewhere. So, but what's really interesting, and what I find really quite troubling in the current moment, is the extent to which a kind of a resurgent neo-Malthusianism has seemingly kind of got traction off laments for the death of nature, which were so common in the 1990s. Indeed, in some environmental contexts, they seem to have been replaced by a rather more straightforward view. Perhaps we need to recognise the game is up. Perhaps we need to wait for the end. Perhaps we need to just embrace collapse. For example, the eminent British political theorist John Gray has responded to the climate crisis by suggesting we should just face up to the facts that humans are essentially rapacious primates, and that our time is probably up. We are doomed by the coding in our DNA to continue along our inexorable path of self-destruction. The Australian ethicist Clive Hamilton has written a requiem for a species. Stephen Emmett, head of computation science at Microsoft Research in Cambridge, sometimes playwright and author of 10 Billion, provides a pithy summary of the wisdom of a surprisingly broad range of radical environmental thought. And there you have it. Okay. So now you might think that, end times ecology, as I'm referring it, is, a fringe element of merely a kind of Malthusian current that's always had a fairly low view of human beings. Yet I think there's an argument to be made that a certain mix of fatalism, cultural pessimism, melancholy and apocalypticism can be found in many more spaces than simply radical environmental currents. And this is how I'm kind of trying to capture this kind of looping that seems to have descended around many traditional North American, in particular romantic forms of environmentalism, where the death of nature is being replaced by this constant looping kind of cultural reference point, this semiotic system, which really descends on all manner of discourse. It's quite surprising. I won't read it. You can just sink into the fatalism of it and embrace your self-hatred of your species. Okay, so, I thought I had another. So what can we say about these other currents then? Well, it could be said that, for example, if you look at, brilliant novels like Cormac McCarthy's The Road or Frank Darabont The Walking Dead, similar concerns emerge. We're starting to see cultural projects in Britain like the Dark Mountain Project, which combines neo-survivalism with a lament for the loss of British culture and British traditions and the English countryside in particular. And so we're starting to see all manner of manifestations of concerns about a human agency that maybe has had its day. And I would even perhaps go so far as to controversially suggest that certain turns even occurring within critical social theory, such as the geological turn or even object-orientated ontologies, can sometimes, in particular articulations, be seen as fringing into a new fatalism where vast cosmic ontologies of our socio-ecological relations are being proposed with all manner of interest in objects, material resources, non-humans, geological forms and the like, all well and good, but scarcely any attention given to the transformative capacities of human agencies, multiple and various. So I think this is a real problem. It's a real problem. It was present in Latour's work, but I think it's being telescoped out further with certain manoeuvres. So how is this being dealt with in terms of our Anglo-American culture? Well, it seems to me that in environmental culture in particular, the return of a generalised dystopian eco-fatalism has particularly fuelled a desire for many to refute this en masse. And we're seeing a very influential counter-discourse now that is mobilising and emerging, which is trying to dig back into the project of modernisation. And if we take one particular manifestation of this, the Breakthrough Institute and the Ecological Modernising Manifesto, we can see that this is a statement of faith and purpose written by 18 prominent environmental scientists, social scientists and campaigners, largely worked through the Breakthrough Institute. And the core assertion of the manifesto is essentially arguing that a full frontal assault needs to be made on ecological end times ecology, ecological romanticism, deep ecology, and everything that would follow in its wake. Okay, so what's the basic kind of argument that eco-modernists are making now? Well, they're arguing essentially that it's high time overfed northern environmentalists recognise that the spread of modernisation over the last 200 years has not just generated a remarkable improvement of living standards, pacification and the benign spread of liberal democracies, that it has delivered and will continue to deliver a range of clear ecological benefits. Indeed, if we continue down our current path a bit in an adjusted manner, we can start to recognise that modernisation, globalised, largely American, and globalised largely through technological innovation, is going to drive ecologically benign processes of decoupling, agricultural intensification and urban densification. So unlike end times ecologists, eco-moderns, or what I would prefer to call technocratic eco-moderns, because there's many traditions of ecological modernism, as I will argue later, see modernism as a right that all members of our global population should share. They see many needs as presently remaining hopelessly unmet and rarely discussed issues by northern environmentalists such as energy poverty are completely evaded, they want to argue. So eco-modernists want to argue that, moreover, there's a remarkable tendency amongst traditional environmentalists to ignore the positive signs. Reforestation is occurring across some parts of the Northern Hemisphere. They're pointing to decoupling that has been suggested in CO2 emissions, and that on the mass movement of people to the city, on balance, will produce good outcomes. So this is essentially the argument, and I think there are a number of reasons to believe that this is an idea and a body of thinking which is now starting to attract a great deal of elite public opinion. So from The Economist to the Financial Times, from the Davos set to the Gates Foundation, it can be observed that a broad eco-modern zeitgeist which would seem to have settled over those sections of the business class that have dispensed with the climate contrarians and now take the challenge of climate change semi-seriously. So I think that, the argument I essentially want to make is these two discourses are very prevalent in shaping our understanding of the future. So the question then arises, how do we engage with these discourses? What can we make of them? Now, clearly, both of these discourses, it could be argued that both of these positions are not entirely without some basis in contemporary, an understanding of the trajectories and the knowledges and the informations emerging from the contemporary environmental sciences. So if we just take, end times ecologists are not entirely wrong in suggesting that, at least if we look at greenhouse gas emissions, many of our trends are heading in the wrong direction, and the likelihood of preventing an average of 2 degrees C of warming this century is slipping away. So I'll just use my little pointer for the first time. So this is where we are. And this is the worst case scenario, which most people believe would be disastrous. Furthermore, eco-moderns are not entirely wrong either to point out that the challenge of decarbonisation must be met within the context of a world where 1.6 billion people around the planet lack access to electricity, and a further 2.7 billion are reliant on various forms of biomass, wood fuel, dung, crop waste, etc. for their energy supply, with many other environmental problems. So they're certainly correct to say that there are desperate needs. They're certainly correct to argue that the scale of the challenge is absolutely enormous. So here's a slide from Roger Pilkey Jr., who's an eco-modernist, who demonstrates very clearly the level of post-carbon free energy that's going to be required and the scale of that project. Similar a slide from an eco-modernist, pointing out that let's just have a look at the current state of our global energy usage. Here, the yellow, the grey and the red are the post-carbon energy sources, where we stand thus far. This is what we would have to significantly decarbonise, and this is pretty much what most the post-carbon energy source that most environmentalists support, yeah? With a push, HEP, and with a very big push, nuclear, but not really. Okay? So there's clearly a huge civilizational challenge. And we might also grant that eco-moderns have a point when they suggest the matter of modernity could do with a rather more complicated engagement than it has often received from assorted currents of radical environmentalism. If one suspends the issue of the genocide of non-moderns, colonialism, imperialism, if we put to one side Frantz Fanon's observation that the entire third world went into the making of European modernity and so on, it's important to acknowledge that for those peoples who survived the Columbian exchange, the slave trade, the age of empire, the decimation of indigenous cultures and peoples, the age of total war and so on, for those who were left and their descendants, remarkable possibilities for human development, vastly unevenly shared, came out the other end. We can acknowledge that some total processes that are summarised under the term modernisation eventually facilitated massive increases in rates of technological development, labour-saving devices, labour productivity improvements, improvements in sanitation, healthcare, control of infectious diseases, improvements in diet, which help contribute to the upward curve in human longevity, the slow humanisation of attitudes to gender and sexuality, and the capacity to blow this entire world to smithereens 50 times over. Excuse me. I think the mic's in agreement. So I think what I'm trying to say in that paragraph, took me a long time to frame that paragraph, is it's complicated. The matter of modernity is complicated. Okay, but what might we say about other issues and claims that they make about decoupling and so on and so forth? Well, it's certainly the case that there are some evidences emerging that decoupling of consumption from natural resources is occurring at a weak level. The black line is GDP, the other lines are natural resource uses, but it's a weak form of decoupling that's occurring at the moment. So the total amount of stuff we're extracting and dumping is not slowing. So we've got a weak decoupling, and that's part of the problem. Similarly, in terms of carbon dioxide emissions, there's quite a lot of debate about this. There was an interesting paper that came out in Nature last week which suggested that for the second year in a row there had been a flatlining of carbon dioxide emissions in relation to economic growth. But similarly, the question and the problem is here is that it's very hard to know whether these are just two data points. And secondly, the issue is not simply about decoupling, it's about decarbonisation. And the amount of decarbonisation, the challenge of decarbonisation is vast. So just saying there's been a hovering is clearly not good enough. Similarly, I think that a problem with the kind of eco-modern, the technocratic vision of eco-modernism that's very ascendant at the moment is that power essentially is almost entirely removed from this worldview, and many of the problems that are already starting to be insubstantiated from as an eco-modern future, as a technocratic eco-modernism starts to move around the planet are starting to become quite apparent. So there's been some brilliant work recently by Julie Zhu's talking about the rise of green cities in China and the problems that are emerging with William McDonough abroad and the extent to which these are actually built on highly problematic labour conditions and exporting their environmental costs to other spaces and places. We're seeing chronic problems with ecologically uneven exchange and displacement, as we have seen the shift of global manufacturing from the north to the south. We're seeing chronic problems with slumification. We're seeing chronic problems with monocultural agriculture. And part of the complexity to the issue here is clearly that in certain conditions and contexts, the movement to the city and global planetary urbanism clearly has got progressive and regressive elements. Clearly, agricultural intensification, mechanisation, the introduction of labour-saving devices is on the one hand, could potentially offer enormous gains for rural peoples. But at the same time, if that's occurring with the context of land grabs, monoculture, and a reliance of the whole global food supply system to around 6 basic crops, which food scientists now are very concerned about the extent to which these monocultures could store up all manner of problems if there were viruses impacting on them. So this is a bit of the gloomy bit. I'll move on from the gloomy bit. Whenever I teach nowadays these environmental issues, I always quickly, after 20 minutes of the litany, have to move on to the uplift, or all the energy sucks out of the room, and it's hard to stick with it. So what is interesting, though, to me, though, about these two hegemonic discourses is that there's also a great deal of commonality in these discourses. And in some respects, it could be argued we're seeing a kind of resetting of an environmental debate that clearly goes back to the 60s and 70s. So in the same way that the limits to growth debate generated the Julian Simons reaction of there is no such thing as scarce resource, and the same extent that in 1987 the Brundtland Report and the subsequent rollout of UN Sustainable Development generated a massive political mobilisation of the free market right across all its think tanks, the Cato Institute, Freedom Magazine, and a massive discrediting operation. It could be seen that this is the next repositioning of the debate, but I think we should pay attention to the extent to which in this repositioning both positions have got rather more in common than is often acknowledged. So for example, it's interesting how both of them are very addicted to binary arguments and generic accounts of the human. So human beings are either ontologically environmental degraders or some historical Promethean mass writ large. Yeah, so the idea that we might have discrete and complex socio-environmental relations which take on different forms in different spaces and places is evaded. Similarly, in terms of the nature of the problem, both of them gravitate towards this claim of the universal we. The universal we is loved by romantic environmentalism. You're at fault. You are at fault. Okay? Whereas the eco-moderns have flipped this around and said that environmental problems are the unfortunate outcome of a modernisation process which we're all in it together. We're all gaining, What's the problem? So I had a little interchange with a climate scientist recently who was making this claim, and I tried to suggest to him, well, if you differentiate carbon emissions, clearly the winners and the losers, who's suffering, who's gaining, is vastly filtered through social and ecological relations. He said, oh, social structural relations, don't be divisive. Let's not even go there. Okay. Similarly, if we think about the whole way in which we get stuck into this strange debate about growth, the idea that we should be for or against growth is the only position. The proposition that we might be able to open up the question to ask growth of what? Growth of what kinds of systems to do what? Are we constructing energy systems to, build hospitals or bomb hospitals? Are we constructing more nuclear plants to drive around our SUVs and leave them on while we go to the grocery store? Or are we growing to build sustainable transport systems? The politics of growth and the political choices in growth is evaded. So you can't have a political debate about growth, it's naturalised. Similarly, sentient publics are completely missing in this narrative. And then it's really striking to me as well the extent to which, I'm trying to think, misspelling there, sorry about that, about the extent to which these discourses as well perhaps reflect particularly Anglo-American or Northern European meets Northern American anxieties about settler societies and how how they have constructed wilderness, how they've constructed their positions in the world, how they've constructed their messianic projects. So within both, there's a kind of messianic project. One is we will teach you to have less and give up. And the other is, of course, the restarting of the Cold War modernising project to kickstart that. Okay, so I've said enough of the critique. Okay, so where are we? Well, I think, let me do a little bit of futuring here. It's my speculation that eco-modernism might well be, and technocratic forms of eco-modernism might be really problematic, but I think as a post-carbon imaginary, I think it's got real legs. And it's my speculation, or my hypothesis, if you like, that we're going to hear more and more of a technocratic, post-carbon form of ecological modernising strategies emerge as the climate news rolls on. So Bill Gates, not related to the Breakthrough Institute, the Breakthrough Energy Coalition, recently announced about 2 months ago, this big coalition of tech CEOs and Gates and so on and so forth, and they're all going to kind of mobilise together and fund clean energy R&D, yeah? Which currently in the US budget stands at about 5 billion to the 70 billion we put into defence R&D. And so Gates is going to give us a billion for that. But what also interests me is the crazy ways in which technocratic eco-moderns could generate all manner of other kinds of urban ecological futures, urban futures, etc. Here's the Libertarian Seasteading Institute, run by Milton Friedman's nephew, and the kinds of visions they have is a way of allowing free people to escape the managerial state by building their Kevin Costner-style SeaWorld entities off the coast of San Francisco, so that tech entrepreneurs can gather together and develop eco-modern solutions just in case the apocalypse is upon us. Here we have it. This is the gated community some of you will be moving into as you reach retirement age, and why not? And then these projects for green cities are being, moving around the planet now, low carbon paradises, and even visions of the future where the densification of the urban will allow, according to the technocratic eco-moderns, for the rest of the world to be rewilded. It's opening up all new possibilities for green lodges and green pleasuring places for people who wear white khaki and nice, beautiful. I love that linen. I always wear it on a holiday myself, and try and walk around. It's all ironed, and then the locals kind of, start to diss me, and go back into the hotel. And so it's interesting how rewilding itself. We're going to rewild the planet. Yes. So what do we do with the 3.5 billion rural people? Well, Sonny Jim, your place is now a zoo. Get the hell out. What do you mean? Get the hell out. Get on the bus, move now. So, and we joke about this, but this could be a Syria writ large, developed further in the right faces, in the right places, if certain groups wanted to do that. So, a couple of futuring propositions. Technocratic ecological modernisation is not going away anytime soon. But it's also the default position of an ideology that informs a great deal of post-political centricism, as well as mainstream eco-design, engineering, and sustainable architecture in the OECD. So be careful, people. Many of you, particularly the more politically docile, are going to be signing up for this. Exactly. Mazda, city in the Middle East. It's the only way I can make a living. So, moderate forms of technocratic eco-modernism are frequently sustained, indeed, in art and design education, pedagogy, through instrumentalism, solutionism, and I will argue the splendid isolation of the liberal arts from art and design, and the lack of integration between the social sciences and art and design education. So, and the problem is that, it could all end very badly. Okay, this might be green technology 2070, yeah? Okay, we did nothing, so let's geoengineer the planet. Okay, so I've done enough dystopias, haven't I? Okay, so let me get back to the great question of Comrade Lenin. Okay, so what is to be done? So when I was doing my PhD, I was really struck by a paragraph in David Harvey's Justice, Nature and the Politics of Difference. And he was discussing viable environmental futures. And he said, we'll have to deal with the material and institution issues of how to organise production and distribution in general, how to confront the realities of global power politics, and how to displace the hegemonic powers of of capitalism, not simply with dispersed, autonomous, localised and essentially communitarian solutions, but with a rather more complex politics that recognises how environmental and social justice must be sought by a rational ordering of activities at different scales. For that to happen, the environmental justice movement has to radicalise the ecological modern discourse. Alternative modes of production, consumption and distribution, as well as environmental modes of environmental transformation, have to be explored if the discursive space of the environmental justice movement and the theses of ecological modernisation are to be joined in a programme of radical political action. And now let me just clarify this quote here. When Harvey was writing this quote, he was talking about ecological modernisation in terms of Northern European reforms that had occurred in the 80s and 90s in Denmark, Germany and Sweden, which seemed to suggest there were many institutional ways in which a kind of corporatist, Christian democratic, social democratic institutional frame could push forward on green consumption, green cities, green innovation or something like that. He's not talking about the North American contemporary reworking of ecological modernism. But it just struck me at the time when I was reading that book, this was a really interesting manoeuvre, and it's a manoeuvre that nobody's picked up on, and it's also really interesting to me that Harvey's recent work seems to have let that go. So even in Spaces of Hope, it's interesting that the utopia that he ends up with in the last piece of his book is quite kind of primitivist almost. So there's covens and there's havens and there's a lot of democracy and there's a lot of hugging, but there's no real description made of the socio-technical or socio-ecological or designed forms that might be present there. I think that's kind of interesting. And then even in his very great book, Rebel Cities, I think it's really interesting how once again, the productive side of the discussion is not present. You know, he's leaned very much to the kind of the Occupy model, and he's leaned very much into a kind of Murray Bookchin confederal municipalist position. But at the same time, it's interesting how the workplace is not very strongly foregrounded in his thinking. So I'll get on to that. So where do we go? Okay, so let me make a few propositional arguments then to rescue where we are from where we should be. Okay, so it seems to me that the first manoeuvre that I think is really important to make at the present time is to recognise there have been many other traditions and many other ways of thinking about future design ecologies. And that if we look at the history of ecological modernities over the last 40 years or so, I would want to argue that they have actually come in many, many different forms, and that there have been many different visions of socio-technical and socio-ecological and socio-spatial reordering that have been flattened out by this discussion. So I've just given you a little handout there, and I'm afraid this was one of those handouts where I sat down and started schematising, and then 12 hours later looked up and I had mapped the whole of the universe into this document. And essentially what I was trying to do in this document is to try and suggest that that not only are there a great plurality of traditions that could be considered ecologically modern, but I think this is the critical point I want to make, which I've tried to make in the document, is that the politics of possible futures is really centred around what these different traditions have presented as fixed and fluid. Okay, so fixity and fluidity of particular relations and institutions is the core realm in which the political foreclosing or opening up occurs. So if you look at my document, essentially what I'm trying to suggest here in this is that technocratic eco-moderns essentially argue that R&D, change of R&D is is fluid. It can be changed. We need more of it. Energy systems, that can be transitioned, although they prefer a particular array of technologies. But a whole range of other things are foreclosed. They're seen as static, they're seen as natural. So the reordering of industrial production, environmental relation, consumption, urban form, agro-rural transitions, accumulation, ownership, control, power relations, broader international relations, these are all frozen in place. Whereas there are many other traditions of ecological modernism which have argued that no, these other things could be fluid. And if we recognise these other things could be fluid, we have many different possibilities to future in many different ways. So let me give you just a few examples of this. So let's take a pretty technocratic tradition of eco-modern thought, which I'm going to call bright green ecology. Bright green ecology has always argued that industrial ecology and the productive centre of industrial societies could itself be reorganised around principles of a circular economy, of a moving from a cradle to grave to a cradle circle of production. And, this has kind of hovered now for about 15 years. And most recently, there was a huge EU study that suggested that, the development of cradle to cradle of a circular economy, in contrast to a shift to renewables, could actually would actually release less than 1/3 of the carbon emissions compared to a business as usual economy. So an act of modelling, may be problematic, maybe not, but nevertheless opening up a space of transformation. Let's talk about consumption, culture, social practices. Juliet Schlor has argued that around 9 to 11% of energy reduction could occur in the United States through social innovation around housework, transportation decisions, new forms of social behaviour, new forms of transportation. Piketty has come up with an interesting study recently that suggested, it's the top 10% of the global population that's responsible for 45% of the global emissions, and that something as simple as consumption taxes on business flights could raise the amount of adaptation costs that the IPCC have argued. And then we have, demilitarisation. If we thought about militarisation in different ways, it could well be that, the energy impact of militarisation was open to public discussion. So next time, we're lurching off towards some foreign war, probably brought on by, President Hillary or whatever, next adventurous activity, don't just ask, how many dead people will that leave? But, do we have the carbon budget for that? I'm not sure we can afford that. Okay, so let me make a second point here. Okay, sorry, a little polemical there, but there you go. Could we start to think about ecological modernities in broader ways which draw publics in? Now, it seems to me that the reason why publics are going to have to be present in the future visions of our futuring is simply because a technocratic ecological modernist project is going to meet resistance. It's going to meet all manner of resistance, particularly the wilder attempts to reboot the modernist project writ large and globalise it. And so what can we say about this? Well, how do we hail publics is clearly the critical question. How do we bring publics into some institutional forms which can allow them to challenge technological and design determinisms of your more technocratic ecological modern forms? Well, it seems to me, once again, design has a lot to offer here. We can dig back into the history of design in many of the ways that people have done this afternoon and suggest that there are a huge amount of traditions that have tried to think about a reordering of socio-technical relations, from countercultural moments of the radical technology movement to participatory planning and participatory budgeting, to discussions of design for social innovation, the kind of Ezio Manzini type of projects that are now very present, to even the kind of design activism around citizen science and global environmental justice, which are trying to both deal with post-carbon issues, but also suggest that they can't be reduced to just post post-carbon issues. That, you know, carbon reductionism is important, but so is conviviality, autonomy, communitarian mixing, citizenship. So there are all manner of resources that design could offer to think about other kinds of design politics for the Anthropocene. But I think there's a problem at the moment with the ways in which that discussion is proceeding, which is that to use, you know, if we frame those kinds of developments, many of them are taking on a kind of cosmopolitical form, and it seems to me that despite their inventiveness, despite their calls for democratic invention, they're quite institutionally thin, and the publics that they hail do not have institutional form. So let me just finish up then by two propositions to think about ways in which we might be able to fill out the forms of public ecologies. So some guy called Neil Brenner has argued that the architectural and design disciplines could significantly enhance their capacities to make durable, progressive urban interventions by engaging more systematically with the questions of institutional redesign. That is the question of collectively binding rules which govern the production, use, occupation, and appropriation of space. So how do we do that? Well, firstly, I think it's to go back to Latour, because he's sometimes really great and sometimes he's really annoying. You know, he's quite right. He was quite right when he said that, you know, back when he observed that the purification and boundary maintenance strategies between the natural and social sciences had kind of fallen apart. That they were a product of a particular historical era and that they'd become counterproductive. What do you do with geography in this social here, natural here frame of reference? And similarly, I think the same question we should ask in relation to the relationship between design and the social sciences. You know, is it the case that their lack of engagement in the 20th century, you know, has been counterproductive to thinking about ecological modernities in the 21st century? So let's just think about how radical sustainable design, the field that it works in. Generally speaking, it hovers around this area. Sustainable design futuring, often now mostly up here. And let's think about the institutional forms that it plays with. Here. That's pretty much it. Okay? If there's any thinking about institutional design forms in design, it's about here, and nothing else is present. Sometimes planning, obviously, we'll get into that. I'm kind of generalising from my own RISD understanding of design. And I think similarly, it could be argued, to turn the tables, that social sciences, you know, have lots of critical social sciences, lots of engagement with this, but when it comes to material form and material objects, they aestheticize them pretty nicely, object-orientated, but the idea that they might actually engage with design and its rich traditions of thinking about material repurposing and making is often lacking in both of them. Okay, so let me cut to the chase here then. So what can we do? Well, one of them would be to bring the sciences and the social science, the critical social sciences and the critical design sciences together and think about institutional form and design experimentation. But I think I'll just finish up with one final thought, which is that it really strikes me that even in the most progressive forms of sustainable design at the moment, sustainable design futuring, there is one particular notion that seems to have entirely slipped from our visions of sustainable design futuring, and that's the category of labour. Now, it just strikes me that labour, both in terms of paid, unpaid, visible, invisible, material, immaterial, effective, has really gone missing from a whole range of sustainable design education, sustainable design pedagogy, and discussions of design futuring. I think it's just really striking how consideration of designers as workers and potentially workers as designers of their own working worlds is completely marginal to design education. Similarly, post-work ideologies, I think, have further pushed this, even critical theorists embracing post-work ideologists, and even kind of avant-garde thinking about the Anthropocene seems more interested in lively natures than labouring human subjects. Sometimes I feel that this is what's happening with a lot of post-humanist discussions at the moment. Like Dr. Manhattan in The Watchmen, he's kind of got bored with the human subject. And so these are the kinds of people that critical design, sustainable design futuring has a lot to say about, yeah? groovy people like you and me, okay? These are the people, though, that design education seemingly has nothing to say about. These are struggles, these are socio-technologies which radical designers seem not to address. And these are the kinds of people that are entirely marginal to the concerns of virtually every design program in the country, or if they exist at all, they'll be in some small little course at the end. You know, they're not present, they're not the creatives, they're not present in that discussion. Why is that? Okay, so I'll just finish up then by saying that, so could it be the case that work, production, and labour need to return to sustainable design futuring? Could it be that there are utopian discussions of the factory as it might have been, which were perhaps worth engaging in a non-ironic, non-Foucauldian kind of scoffing kind of way? Maybe there's a reappropriative manoeuvre that could go on here. Could it be that we could start to think about a worker-centred design? There were currents in the 70s. I'm really interested in the 70s at the moment. Sweden, Denmark in the 70s, the minor plan, worker-orientated design. This is Pele N, who's coming to RISD soon, very excited about this. And he and his colleagues in the 70s started to try and bring trade unions in to discussions about systematically retrofitting their workplaces and allowing for forms of technological innovation which had some input from the workers. Similarly, the Lucas Plan in Britain was trying to do exactly the same thing, shut us down. No, we can retrofit the whole factory, we can produce socially useful goods. Our knowledges could allow, working with professional designers, could produce other kinds of goods. So I'll just finish off with a few questions then, which I'll throw back to bright green eco-modern positions. So if we're going to retrofit the production process through industrial ecologies, as I think we must, what would a participatory industrial ecology look like that took knowledge, creativity, and innovative skills of working people seriously? What would it look like? Could we do it better? Could we do something much more interesting than even kind of McDonough's notions? If we take the value of cosmopolitical experiments, and there's enormous value in all of them, I don't want to sound like I'm dismissing that, what would it mean if we didn't just do cosmopolitics in the art gallery and in the museum, but we actually did cosmopolitics in the factory and the workplace and the financial institution, and we tried to ask cosmopolitical questions about ownership and control? That'd be interesting to see if you get a big grant to do that, yeah, wouldn't it? Okay, what would it mean to reach back to the 70s again? Someone like Dolores Hayden, who we've been teaching at the moment, I still absolutely love and think she's so fantastic. And so, what would it mean to do sustainable design futuring that opened up labour to effective, immaterial labour, non-paid labour, and think about designed forms that were explicitly addressing gender, race, and other issues, and we're bringing back together that possible vision of the future that is informed, that draws together social theory, social science, and critical design and critical architecture. So is it possible we could have those discussions? Okay, so I think I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
I propose that you take the seat.
Okay.
Is this on? Yes. So, Damien, thank you for an extremely powerful, provocative intervention. I can't wait to read your book. And, it's going to be, I think, a very important intervention. So the field of debate on ecology and ecological modernization, as Lefebvre once said in a totally different context, is the site for a great outburst of confusion. So part of what I think we learned from Damien's analysis is just that we cannot take these discourses for granted as scientific or social scientific or as neutral and sort of just objective kinds of interventions, but they're permeated with ideology. So I think it's an extremely eloquent survey and kind of critical assessment of some of the dominant strands of, a very multidisciplinary field of discussion about ecology and kind of human life. So just simply attuning us to that, which I think people in this room will already agree, like, yes, it's not neutral, it's not just technical, it's mediated through power, it's mediated through ideology, it's mediated through culture. Like, yes, we agree, but even within the parameters of that broad agreement, I think it's fair to say, Damien offers us a very powerful, provocative, controversial critique of the technical side. We have a lot of this discussion, obviously, here in our school, slightly different variations thereof related to ecological urbanism and smart cities and green urbanism and so forth. So it's a very appropriate intervention. But another thing that Damien does, I mean, he and I both come from more the social science side, but Damien subjects the social scientific world of debate on ecology to, in some ways, just as devastating a critique. In other words, it's not somehow insulated from this realm of kind of ideological proliferation. So I think it's particularly powerful in that sense that that we need to sort of be aware of that. And I think that we'll open it up for questions and see where you all want to take this. But in some ways, what I take to be Damien's most general message is that the dominant strands of interpretation on these matters, depoliticize them. I think that's the fundamental, if I may generalize maybe a little bit, sort of broadly. It's a depoliticization of the discourse. So just as a starting point for beginning to have a coherent and informed and responsible approach to these matters, simply in discussion, bracketing the question of what is to be done, we need to first understand that they're fundamentally political. So I think a lot of the work that Damien has done in this particular presentation is just to show us the ways in which they're inflected through a whole range of political ideologies, which I'm like fully sympathetic to that. We have about 20 minutes for discussion, and what I like to do in these things is get lots of voices in, and then we'll give Damien maybe an opportunity to reply, and then maybe we can do a second round. So I got the mic, and I'll do the game show host thing and run around the room. Maybe what we can do is, we don't want to get any cross, whatever you call that. Yeah, Tamara has one. So maybe, Tamara, if you could do this side, and I'll do this side, and we just open the floor up, comments, questions, critiques for Damien. Let's collect a bunch, and then depending on how we're doing for time, we give Damien a chance to reply, and then we go back to you all again. The floor is open. Who wants to start? And it would be helpful if you'd start at the bottom so I don't have to sprint up, but if someone at the top wants to talk first, I will sprint up maybe not sprint, but walk briskly up the staircase and wake up my legs after a long day in the office. Anyone? Oh yeah, great, John, thank you.
Just really quickly, I just wanted, something that came up, I think, several times for you was the concept of naturalization. And so I don't have a question around that. It's just something that I think is, that maybe that's something you could elaborate on, because it may not be clear the extent to which that plays a role in almost everything you're talking. It seems to me that that's almost at the base of of all of the things you're trying to unmask in some ways.
Thank you, John. Please. Thank you.
The stairs, or the unevenness of those stairs is really disorienting. Thank you, Damien. Amazing. And I mean, I guess that, I had to run out for a second there. I missed, Neil, your comments, so forgive me if you touched on this, but there seems to be something fundamental here about the sort of embeddedness of this depoliticization in the field of architecture, right? And that even when we sort of imagine the potential for sustainability, I mean, a lot of these great lists that you had, and we're still sort of kind of over here, right? Well, let's just kind of fix it with some technological, kind of gizmos. And so I think, I guess there's a question of, I guess putting you on the spot a little bit, but if you imagine the kind of ways in which this discourse can be repoliticized, how does one encounter the sort of threats that entails to the sort of normative institutions? I mean, is this a revolutionary position in a sense, right? Or do you see a potential, or what are the kind of other potentials, or do we need to articulate those other potentials for other forms of kind of change making that you're proposing?
I'll just underscore that while someone else meditates on what they want to say next. But I think this is really a powerful point, because part of how power operates is precisely through hiding its own operations. I mean, you can read that from Marx, you can read that from Foucault, you can read that via feminist theory and queer theory. So I think it's a pretty powerful argument that has a lot of different institutional implications. So in that sense, by politicizing it, it's not, like, part of what I take from this comment is that it's not just an epistemological move of saying, hey, it's political, it's not just technical. That already involves a pretty strong, almost attack on how institutions all around us and that we work in operate. So just, I agree, like, this would be a very productive thing to explore as we try to track the implications of your powerful critique for broader operations of design and ecology. Other comments, questions? Please, yes. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm wondering whether you could say a little bit more about futuring, because it occurs to me that a move from the idea of utopia to the idea of futuring seems to indicate a more process-oriented approach, and that might be my interpretation of it, but I would love to hear some more about the concept.
Yep. Anyone else? Jump in, great.
Thanks, Damien. So I'm wondering about the tension between sort of innovation and the more, or kind of less glamorous realities of things like repair and maintenance. And so Nigel Thrift and Stephen Graham and others have talked about the kind of invisibility and the kind of the broader invisibility of repair, which is so central to kind of how cities and how landscapes hold together. Although increasingly, as we see these infrastructural crises, repair is becoming, and maintenance, it's very clear that a kind of neoliberal context is starting to kind of dissolve some of that kind of invisibility. And so I'm not a designer, but I'm wondering about, the design profession's kind of impulse on creating new, and sort of how you might fit these kind of tensions around innovation or creation with, a way in which kind of repairing or maintaining some of these systems that are under threat, things like public transit or public housing, how that sits with this kind of impulse towards creating new and this kind of eco-imaginary that you're talking about.
So I'm not sure if this is a question or just a comment, but one of the strange things about architecture, and I am speaking from a disciplinary perspective, that's why it may not be a question, is that it's very good sometimes at faking change in order to give a picture of it. You might think, for instance, of some of the work of Thomas Heatherwick, where he's making a building look sustainable even though its function is not at all sustainable. The aesthetics of pretense, if you like, have always been something that architecture could bring to the table. And in a way, wanting to redesign the process by which something real gets inserted into status quo systems has to take those status quo systems into account. That, I think, is it's a big issue with trying to reimagine architectural processes of production. And I wonder how much, or to what extent, the elision of aesthetics from the second half of today's conference could be challenged in that light. Does that?
Anyone else? Damien has a lot of work to do already, but the point, on some level, the point of this is also not just to, ask Damien for all the answers, but to collectively reflect on the issues raised. So does anyone else want to come in? Yeah, let's go to that side. No, go ahead.
Yeah. Also, the way you connected issues of sort of responses to scalar problems in urbanism and architecture, when you sort of situated the discourse between the modernist and the postmodernist conception of what claims you can make to sort of structural change as opposed to sort of localist, what some have called like folk political change. I'm wondering how that issue of scale also, I mean, also sort of mirrors an issue of temporality that sort of still lingers from a postmodernist approach, which is, like, as you have said, sort of the abandonment or the disenfranchised future as sort of like a certain position within both the left and the right to sort of abandon any prescriptive sort of scalar futurity from the decision. And I'm just thinking of, I mean, critiques. I mean, how can, if you're arguing for a sort of scalar reappropriation, how can the future be reappropriated on a scalar level? When one says the future has been evacuated, it's not. It's been appropriated. It's in the financial derivative markets. I mean, that's how futures are sort of traded. So I'm wondering how that sort of systematized thinking of the future can be taken to a critical position, to a non-sort of neoliberal structure. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think there's one more behind you. If you could kindly pass the mic back to Kate.
Yeah, thanks. I wonder if we're going to talk about repoliticizing these eco-modernist futures, if we don't need to rethink politics, political structures and spaces themselves. And you alluded to this a little bit with cosmopolitan design, and I just wanted to kind of push on that and hear more about that.
Anyone else want to jump into this complex equation? Damien.
Yeah. Okay. Oh my God.
Reactions,
Oh,
thoughts.
it's like the ultimate crit here, isn't it? Thank you. I so appreciate your comments. They're so fantastic. So my proviso comment would be, I don't know all the answer to this, and I would welcome ongoing engagement to figure these things out. But I'll have a stab at a few issues. Well, firstly, on the scalar issue, the thing that really strikes me about the postmodern moment is just how, capital has no problem with this scalar issue. Capital has generated the Anthropocene now, and it's generating, planetary-wide urban-scale transformations of a like, we've never seen before. You're mapping them, and it's doing them happily. And yet we are still caught in the Leotardian moment that to propose anything other than little narratives is a dogmatic disaster. And I think it's really clear now that that was an absolute disaster for the left. And so in terms of how to address the scalar question, I think a little element of the answer is that some element of the technocratic eco-modernist agenda is not entirely wrong. The Anthropocene has unleashed a planet which is made rather than given, is designed rather than, an artifact of nature. And this is why design is so important. So I have both a critique of design, but I have a kind of utopian hope that design, in its best strides, it reconceptualized, could step up to the plate there. I mean, in terms of, this goes to the question of, well, what are we talking about? Well, I'm clearly talking about some kind of either a cross-disciplinary re-engagement or a complete implosion. And I think it's very easy, when you sit in the academy and you've vested so much kind of time, money, income in your little silo to believe that it's going to exist forever. And that's what a lot of geographers thought, And that geography in the United States is, fragmenting significantly and might be called environmental studies in 10 years, So, these institutional silos can seem very firm, but look what happened to Soviet studies. And our and Latour is absolutely right here. The idea that, why is it that we accept us design architects, friendly people, that Latour is absolutely right. The natural and the social, that distinction was ridiculous. What do you do with historical ecology? What do you do with environmental history? What do you do with ecological anthropology? What do you do with climate science in the Anthropocene, which needs social science? So we buy that argument without a problem, yeah? We don't have a problem with the idea that all the environmental sciences should be enmeshed within the social sciences, and that the fluidity of the dialogue should be there. In the same way that 10 years ago we came to accept that STS should exist as a fluid dialogue, and before that gender studies, racial studies, etc. So that's certainly true, but it's also true to reflect on the fact that all these cross cross-disciplinary fields, I'm looking at Nate here, political ecology is another example, are weak. You know, they're weak, they're sidelined, they're marginal. So I think the interesting question here is, in the first instance, design programs desperately need design anthropologists, political ecologists, sociologists of design, historians of science and technology studies, urban studies, geographers, sociologists, multidisciplinary people, theorists, to be not just present in the programme, you know, on the sidelines in a decorative way, but central to the curriculum. That's what I think, and I'm obviously biased, yeah? But I also do wonder, in my wilder Latourian moments, where we need new disciplines. I mean, is it so terrible to say, you know, maybe architecture's had its day? So, you know, to go back to the question of, you know, architecture, innovation, newness, I think there's an interesting argument to be made in the overbuilt global north now, whether, you know, within the hierarchy of the design disciplines, whether adaptive reuse really needs to ascend now as the dominant design form, that sustainable design futuring joins it, and then architecture is something that you can do as a concentration maybe, or a minor, yeah, new build, but you know that shouldn't be. And obviously, I'm pulling your chains here a little bit, but you know, I think there's a really important argument there. And then in terms of newness and design, I think the most sustainable design is over that. And so if you look at some of the best work in sustainable design now, you know, just, you know, product system services, design beyond the object, most of the really smart industrial designers that I teach all say the modernist project's gone, we don't want more stuff, we want to devise systems and services and post-object possibilities and objects that are repairable, reusable, you know, can grow stuff from. And so, you know, that's really out there, it's really present. And, you know, the problem, again, to draw from another issue earlier that you raised in your talk is, the unfortunate problem at the moment is that all these great moments are co-opted so quickly. So, you know, the sharing economy, brief flickering, a utopian possibility, and then Uber, yeah? And so, and the problem with the left, once again, is that the left could, if it had a rich design culture linked to a critical science, a social science, could have fought the battle of reappropriation there. You know, if it had design, social science, social movements, and it was saying, okay, Uberification's not good enough, there are multiple paths that designed economy could have gone and still could go. You know, we can make that argument, but instead a mixture of orthodox Marxism and orthodox liberal post-structuralism throws in the towel immediately to demonstrate the moment of governmentality or commodification has emerged, and it was self-evident, and it was premised in the structural basis of the moment. So I think I've said a lot there already, yeah. So I mean, I'll be interested to wonder what you think. I mean, what do you think? We've got quite similar positions in design schools, and you're a social scientist in a design school. You came here because you see that potentiality, don't you?
I don't know what I am.
Yeah, but you
No,
might.
I'm teasing.
I mean, in terms of you want a reconstructive moment to planetary urbanism, I imagine. Is this going to occur in a design school?
So now I've got to answer these questions. I mean, look, I definitely don't have the answers to these questions, but maybe just a few reflections, and then what I would propose is we should end our formal proceedings here in this room. It's been a long day, it's late, and continue the conversations individually. I think it's been an incredibly generative intervention by Damien and fantastic comments. We could, you know, talk about this, and hopefully we will continue this conversation. I mean, from my point of view, you know, big sort of takeaway issues that I want to keep thinking about. Damien's choice to frame it around futuring rather than utopia. So that point was raised, and I think there's a lot. That's just a very interesting framing, and a number of the questions went to that formulation. And there's of course a literature that Damien's building on and extending related to futuring. So that temporal moment, which Damien of course also spatializes and ecologizes, if we may put it that way. So I think that's a very productive intervention into this discussion. Another thing that I would just pose, which we don't have time to resolve now, but I think resonates with sort of issues in this room, in our program, in terms of doctoral students and your work, the whole way in which most, if not all, of the big political, disciplinary, and institutional questions that Damien has posed, as he himself emphasizes repeatedly, they have a much longer history. In other words, they may be taking a new form in the current moment of the Anthropocene or whatever you want to call it, but these debates about disciplinary boundaries, the debate about the status of ecological questions in various fields, including in the design disciplines, the question about ideological mystification of technology, ecology, and design, and of course the sort of permanent, almost existential question and deeply political question from Lenin and so many others, what is to be done? But I just think it's interesting to kind of, part of what I see Damien's work as doing is posing that question in a particular nexus of disciplinary universes and trying to bring them into productive and also agonistic dialogue with one another. And I think that's really a very, whether you agree with Damien's particular position, and he's, I think playfully provoking us with some of his polemic, and I think it's quite appropriate, but part of what I think Damien is trying to do is just encourage us through his provocations to have a much more political, normative, ethical debate about these matters. So again, I'm just restating in some ways where I began my comments, but I think it bears repeating precisely because of the ways in which within the different disciplinary divisions of labor, the questions are formulated in much more technical and bounded ways. And so however one lands on the question of whether there should be a future discipline of architecture or urban theory or any of the above, ecology, the point is also that we need the starting point, I think, and I think probably Damien will agree with this, is that we can explore those questions best by politicizing all of these different fields. And also, I would add to that, by reflecting on the ways in which historically, in different phases of their evolution, they've actually been politicized and depoliticized in different historical moments in the past. Maybe one last comment, and we should probably express our gratitude to Damien for his comments.
I find it interesting that the use of the idea of politicizing and that this is about being politicized. I think the most empowering thing that Damien is saying in analyzing these groups is this question of what's fixed and what's fluid, and that as a designer and a professor in a design school, we as designers, we like to work on what we can do, and that has led to a very impoverished image of our role. And I think that that's the fundamental challenge. It addresses the question of scale, and that the powerful thing about the techno-modern, eco-modern dialogue is that all of these things are movable. And if that's about politics, maybe it's about politics. But I think if we think about politicizing things, is just another way of creating more categories, and I think that the opportunity is to find more realms of action, and that this question of what is fixed not being fixed and what is fluid being opportunity, and expanding our vision of what it is we take on is the great opportunity.
Super helpful. Thank you very much for that. And maybe just one other, certainly a footnote to that, which also is maybe a bit of a response to Damien's question about what I actually think, which is just that it's just a sentence or two. In terms of extending the realms of action, as you suggest, the way that I've been framing that lately is in terms of redesigning processes. So I've been kicking around this notion of an alter urbanization. And it's not just about designing different spaces, but different processes for the production of space, which to some degree for me that's derived from Henri Lefebvre's work, but it could be a more general provocation. And I think lots of designers do that, even if we don't always think of it that way. We sometimes think of it in terms of spaces that we're designing. But in so doing, can we also redesign the processes? That would also be a connection to this issue about institutional redesign. In any case, I think it's time to call it a day, everyone. Thank you so much, Damien, for a brilliant, provocative lecture. Thanks to all of you for your comments. Let's give